Academy Festival of Ideas and Enrichment. We're looking forward to making this a summer annual event. This is our second summer of offering the festival, and just really bringing you lectures from Yale faculty covering all kinds of different topics of interest, from arts and humanities topics to science and politics and world affairs. And this obviously is a topic of great intrigue, the Voynich Manuscript. Claire Bauern is professor of linguistics at Yale. Following her graduation from Harvard University in 2004, she spent 4 years in Rice University's Department of Linguistics before coming to Yale in 2008. Her research focuses on the languages and history of Indigenous Australia. She's been working with speakers of endangered Indigenous languages since 1998, both through her fieldwork with the last speakers of several languages from Northern Australia, and through her archival work with historical records ranging from the 1770s to the mid-1960s. So this is a whole other topic area that hopefully we'll be able to bring Claire back to talk to us about some of these Indigenous languages. Her work combines traditional methods of language documentation and reconstruction with computational methods more familiar from work in biology. At Yale, she teaches both graduate and undergraduate students about language and language change. And in 2016, when she saw the Voynich manuscript, she was immediately intrigued. And so for the last few years, she's been applying these methods of language documentation to this mysterious manuscript. We are quite lucky to have a real life Indiana Jones of sorts of languages with us today. Claire, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation. Just before I do that, I want to share to everyone, if you have questions, please put your questions in the Q&A section, the Q&A box, and not in the chat window. And we'll do Q&A after Claire's presentation is complete. All right, Claire, thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Lauren. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get right underway. I should say I'm not monitoring the chat at the moment, but if there's anything that goes wrong, I'm sure Lauren will bring it to my attention. So thank you all for coming to hear about the Voynich manuscript today. What I'd like to do here is take you on a bit of a tour of the manuscript, as well, one of the treasures of Yale, and one of the things that I think really brings together a whole array of ideas of the mysterious and this kind of medieval ideas of medieval mystery and skullduggery and so on. But it also allows us to look at how we can combine insights from science, such as radiocarbon dating, and linguistics, so looking at the features of text and the scientific study of language, along with humanities disciplines from history of art, paleography, and so on, to shed light on this manuscript. And it's really the sort of manuscript that needs an interdisciplinary approach and needs insights from all of these areas, because it really is quite it's a unique object, but also an object that has ties to things that are a bit more familiar. And so in my talk today, I'm going to take you through the manuscript. So sorry, sorry about that. I am in my office, and I have light sensors, and they go off if I stay sitting too long. So hopefully we will have some light for a little bit longer. Yeah, so I'm going to take you through manuscript 408 and talk about the composition of the manuscript, some of the contents, and how in particular language documentation and linguistic approaches will let us see something about how what's in the manuscript, and indeed whether it's a language or whether it's a hoax or some sort of gibberish or made up constructed language as well. So my aim is to talk for roughly 50 minutes or so until about 5 o'clock, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions after that. So as I mentioned, the Voynich manuscript is manuscript 408 in the Beinecke library. Here's a photograph from the Beinecke of the front cover and of the Orbis catalog entry. So you can see it has a very simple, unassuming cover and an unassuming title as well. It's known in the manuscript, in the catalog, as simply a cipher manuscript. It has a wide date range from somewhere between 1400 and 1599. We have a little bit of information about the it's made of parchment and so on. The cover, as you can see, is a limp vellum binding. It's called and cover, so it's this is not the original binding. It was rebound at some point in the history of the manuscript. When people see this manuscript for the first time, they often remark on how small it is. That it's smaller than they expected. It's about this sort of size. If you can, I guess you can't quite see that. So roughly the size, maybe the size of my head, or also a bit wider. And it's quite a thick manuscript. But they're expecting, I think, given the imposing nature of the mystery around it, they're expecting some gigantic tome with buckles and things like that. But no, it's quite an unassuming manuscript. Many people comment on the mystery of this manuscript and the peculiarities of it. So it's a manuscript written in an unknown script with unknown meanings, but nonetheless, that hasn't stopped people from trying to decipher it or assuming that they have deciphered it. It hasn't stopped others from saying that there is no underlying message, that it's an elaborate hoax that was either a medieval hoax or a modern hoax. Mostly these days, people talk about the medieval hoax. And this has really entered the popular imagination and has been reported in the popular media. So every 6 months to a year or so, we see some claim about how the mysterious Voynich manuscript has been either partially or fully decoded. So here's one from 2014, for instance. This mysteriosity has made it into the headlines as well. So the Voynich manuscript, famously mysterious medieval text, has been decoded, or has it? Sometimes people are very categorical that the manuscript has been solved after 600 years. Although I particularly like this headline from the Daily Express in the UK, because it's filed under conspiracy theories. So not under medieval art or book knowledge or linguistics, but rather conspiracies. And so it goes. So this is from National Geographic. Did code breakers crack this mysterious medieval manuscript? It's not all about the solutions and the theories of solution, though. So others have written about the topic itself, about the topic of what appeals, what is it about the Voynich manuscript that appeals to people so much. So, for instance, there was a Washington Post op-ed by Dr. Lisa Davis a couple of years ago about this idea of the conspiracy theory and so on. Yet still these things go on, either with the latest artificial intelligence techniques or with a curse of inspiration or a sudden lightning bolt of inspiration. Given the amount of lightning around here at the moment, we maybe some of that lightning will inspire us to decipher the Voynich manuscript this afternoon. We have, this one is from 2019. There was another one from 2020. We're about due for a new solution. There hasn't been one in the last 6 months or so. My favorite one is this Ars Technica set of headlines. So we have, it's finally been decoded, but then there's an update that says, well, so much for that Voynich manuscript solution, a couple of days later, where there's a rebuttal for the manuscript. And this was the most recent one from an Egyptologist from 2020. So you can see there's a large following of Voynich aficionados or of people with an interest in this manuscript and a personal stake in the solution to this manuscript. I should probably declare at the outset, so I don't have a solution for this manuscript. I don't know what it says. I have some ideas that I'll talk to you about, but there are some things I would be very surprised if they turn out to be true, and other things that I would be less surprised about. But I still very much think of this as a mysterious manuscript, or as something where we need to know a lot more about the underlying linguistic structure. So with that, let's have a look about to start with, about what we do know about the Voynich manuscript. I talked a lot about about the mysterious aspects of how it's entered our imagination and popular culture and so on. But let's now get a bit grounded in what the manuscript actually can tell us. So I'm going to start with the physical manuscript and its composition. So the manuscript, as is quite common for medieval manuscripts, is not a single topic. It's rather 5 different parts which have been bound together. And if we look at the illustrations for these topics, because 4 of the 5 parts of the manuscript are illustrated, we can make some guess as to what the topics that underlie the manuscript are. And so the 5 parts are, there's a section on plants, on stars, astrology, astronomy. There's a Bioneological section about baths, a pharmaceutical section, and then an unillustrated section as well. So we'll start by just looking through some of these things. The herbal section takes roughly half the manuscript. The manuscript is about 220 or so pages, although some pages are missing, and the herbal section of the manuscript is roughly half of that. You can see it's beautifully illustrated with each page has a picture of a plant, and then some text associated with it. Some of these plants look quite familiar. So for instance, this could be a marigold. It has the shape, at least the flowers of a marigold. It has the kind of spiky leaves. On the other hand, other aspects of the illustrations are very much not like plants in the real world. So for instance, this plant has cubed roots with squares in it, and no natural plant has anything like that. So this combination of the realistic and the imaginative, or the very non-realistic, is a feature of this type of manuscript. That's not unique. There are other manuscripts that look a little like that, but it's quite unusual for these sorts of herbals. Okay. The next section is the astrological and astronomical diagrams. We have many of these circular diagrams with stars. Some of them have constellations depicted, we presume. So for instance, this constellation here, if we zoom in, looks like it might be the Pleiades. So we have 7 stars in a cluster here, and then we have Aldebaran to one side. This has led many people to think that maybe we can read the manuscript through deciphering the labels. So for instance, if this label, this sort of 8OA 9, as it's written in some of the conventions, could be something like Taurus or Taureau, in which case that would give us a clue into some of the other characters in the manuscript. Unfortunately, none of those methods of decipherment from the labels have borne fruit yet. But it's a possibility that we could keep looking at. In addition to the star diagrams, we also have zodiac diagrams. So, for instance, we have here the goat, Capricorn. And you can see here also that someone has written April, so or Abril, Abril, in a non-ciphered script as well. So this is most likely Old French, or a language related to Old French. This was done probably at a later time from the composition of the manuscript. You can see, for instance, it's in a different ink from the cipher text around it. So people have been puzzled for this over this manuscript for quite a long time. Then we have the Bioneological section, and this is also a very peculiar aspect of the manuscript. This is the section of the manuscript that has illustrations of women naked women in baths or water, some green, some blue, connected by pipes of various sorts. Here's another set of pages that shows this, and here's a bit more detail here. And so the assumption here is that this is some type of maybe women's health manual or an illustration of medical practices. But again, it's hard to link the illustrations to specific practices, unlike some other manuscripts of the time, like the Trochello manuscript, for instance, which where the diagrams are very clear illustrations of, say, positioning of turning babies in childbirth and things like this. The Bioneological section of the Voynich Manuscript appears to be quite different. The next section is the recipes section. So in this case, we have what we presume to be jars. Here, these red pillar things, they look like spice jars or medicinal containers. We have illustrations of roots, which could be ingredients to potions or ingredients to the recipes, and then text associated with that as well. And then finally, we have what are known as the starred paragraphs. This section of the manuscript is not illustrated. It has paragraphs set off by these stars, which you can see at the in the left-hand edge as well. Some other things you can see from the manuscript here is that the text is quite legible, legible in the sense that even though we can't read the meanings of the words, we can see what the text is, and we can decipher or we can see the letters of that make up the script. So it's easy to read, even if we can't read what it actually says. We can also see that the words are divided into words with spaces, and we have paragraphs and structure in the manuscript as well. So, for instance, right here we have a capital of the more ornate thing that introduces the paragraph. Some other things we can say about the manuscript. So it's written from left to right in lines, unlike some other types of scripts which are written in other orders. So, for instance, Hebrew and Arabic are typically written right to left. Mongolian is written from top to bottom, and so on. So this we can see, the Voynich script we can see is written from left to right with a jagged right-hand end and a left justified ending. We have 21 or so common characters, and then a number of other uncommon characters, astrological symbols, and the stars, like we saw in the starred paragraphs. And so that means the script is unlikely to be either a syllabic script, like is used in Korean, for instance. It's likely to be some sort of alphabet, although the relationship between the actual letters and the sounds that underlie the language, if it is a language, is something that we'll talk about a little later on, and that is not at all clear at this point. Some of the features of the script are worth noting in some detail as well. So the script is a mixture of characters which are quite familiar from the Latin alphabet, and other characters which are not at all familiar. So, for instance, we have things that look like 8s. We have things that look like 9s. So you can see here we have something that looks like an 8 and then a 9. We have C's. We have A's. We have here's a 4. But then we also have what are known as the gallows characters in the manuscript. There are 4 different characters that look like they're related to one another, but have quite a different structure, and these are basically unparalleled in as letters in other manuscripts, and also in other alphabets as well. So there've been theories that the manuscript might be glagolitic, so related to Russian or Georgian, or it might be Indic, but none of these characters are found in these other writing systems as well. In terms of dating of the manuscript, there's various things that let us converge on the early 15th century as the most likely time that the manuscript was written. So, for instance, there's been carbon dating of the parchment, and that puts the age of the parchment, or rather the age of the time of death of the animal from which the parchment was made, to be totally precise, between somewhere around approximately 1410 to 1440. So if I remember right, it was say 1408 to 1436 is where most of the hypotheses or most of the date calibrations might fall. And so this sort of early 15th century date is consistent with a number of other aspects of the manuscript as well. So the ink, for instance, the ink can't be dated directly through carbon dating, but it's the chemical composition of the ink has been analyzed, and it's a fairly regular iron gall ink, which is utterly typical of manuscripts of the period. We can look at the style of dress of the characters in the Zodiac illustrations, as I've illustrated here, for instance. And this style of dress is also consistent with early to mid 15th century clothing. We can look at the style of illustration, such as the drawings of the plants and the drawings of the castle that's in one of the fold-out sections, and these are also consistent with at least some manuscripts of the time. And the script itself is also consistent with some sort of italic humanistic script of roughly this period, although we can't locate it precisely. Okay, so this is I know there's been some claims that Voynich himself might have made the manuscript, might have used recycled parchment to create the manuscript. I think at this stage we can pretty comprehensively rule that out. So it's not a modern forgery. It is a medieval object. Voynich had Voynich created the manuscript from medieval materials. Of course, as an antiquarian book dealer, he had access to such materials, but he would have had to have known that. So remember, he would be doing this in 1912 or so. Carbon dating wasn't invented until the 1940s, and so he would be faking a medieval manuscript prior to at a time when there was no method of dating actual materials, and so that makes it very unlikely that, and also for other reasons, that he created this manuscript, or anyone in the 19th or early 20th century created the manuscript. We can think of this as a genuine medieval object. And so if it is a hoax, or if some sort of non-language gibberish was used in its creation, it must have happened at the in the early 15th century. Okay. Moving on, I just wanted to give you a brief view of the characters or the letters that make up the Voynich manuscript. It's been customary for the last 30 years or so to use a set of Latin characters or English characters or letters to stand in for Voynich characters. It makes it easier to type, and it makes it easier to analyze the text computationally. And so these equivalences are made partly on the basis of how the letters look. So for instance, this Voynich A looks like a script A. The N looks like a script N, the O looks like a script O. The F and the P don't really look anything like P's or F's. But it's important to remember that these are not hypotheses about how the Voynich manuscript actually sounded, but rather a convenient way of representing the information, the text information in the manuscript while typing and while doing computational analyses. Last thing I wanted to mention about the script is that so we've talked about the composition of the manuscript, but we haven't yet talked about how many people were involved in writing the manuscript. And Lisa Fagan-Davis, who is the executive director of the Medieval Academy of America and a Yale PhD graduate, has investigated this for the Voynich manuscript in some detail, and has shown that most likely 5 different people were involved in the composition of the manuscript. Several of the scribes were involved in just a couple of pages, whereas other scribes were involved in substantial sections of the manuscript. There's also evidence that they collaborated on the manuscript as well. So my lights have gone off again. I guess you can see me without the lights, not too bad at this point, so I'll wait for it to come back on. Yeah, so we have evidence for 5 different people involved in different aspects of the manuscript production. For instance, one scribe did basically all of the astronomical section. Another 2 scribes worked on the botanical section. Let me now, so having thought about the time, having thought about the composition of the manuscript and its parts, and I've shown you a little bit about the script and so on. Let me now talk a little bit about how the manuscript comes in and out of history. So we've located the origin of the manuscript in the early 1400s, so somewhere in the first half or so of the 15th century. From there, it disappears. We have no record of where it went after it was first composed, but it first surfaces around 1608 in Bohemia at the court of Rudolf II. And we know this because the signature of this gentleman here, Jacobus Herecki de Tepenetz, his signature is on the first page of the manuscript. We know he became de Tepenetz in 1607. He was given a dukedom, if I remember right, by Rudolf II. And so this dates his coming into possession of the manuscript at some time after 1608. From there, the manuscript is passed around various people at the court of Rudolf II until 1665, when it enters the library of Athanasius Kircher. Now, Kircher was a polymath. He was a linguist. He was very interested in codes and ciphers and unknown languages, and he had some correspondence with people at Rudolf II's court about this manuscript, and they were the correspondence is available online. I can give you the link if you're interested. But it doesn't seem like Kircher actually worked on the manuscript, and certainly was not able to decipher it as far as we know. The manuscript then disappears. Presumably, it stays among his papers. But the next we see is when Wilfred Voynich, whose photo is here, takes the manuscript along, or acquires the manuscript, should we say, along with a number of other manuscripts from the Jesuit archives at the Villa Mondragone, just outside of Rome. And this is in 1911 or 1912. And from there, the manuscript is in Voynich's possession till his death. He bequeaths it to his wife, Ethel Voynich. She bequeaths it to Anne Neal. Voynich presumably acquired the manuscript with the aim of selling it, and in fact, he goes to some lengths to establish a noble provenance and noble pedigree of this manuscript. So he associates it with Roger Bacon, and with key figures in medieval ciphers and cryptology and so on and so forth. But he's unable to sell it. His executors are unable to sell it, and finally it ends up in amongst the books of Hans Kraus, who is an antiquarian bookseller, who donates it to the Beinecke Library in 1969. And so the manuscript has been at the Beinecke ever since, and here is a photograph of it when it was on display. The manuscript is no longer on regular display due to its fragility. But the Beinecke does have a beautiful facsimile, which is quite realistic. It's you can tell the difference between the real manuscript and the facsimile, but it's beautifully done down to the recreation of holes in the parchment and things like that. So since it's 1969, Voynich has been in the Beinecke. I saw it in when it was last on display in 2015 or 2016, and thought it would be a great way to talk about linguistics and a great way to introduce students to ideas in linguistics, as well as a research area of interest to me as well. So I've been teaching a class in Yale College over the last couple of years on the Voynich manuscript as well. So so this has been a bit of a tour of the manuscript. We've seen a bit about the script and its composition and so on. So where can we look for evidence to shed light on the more of the circumstances of the materials, what the manuscript might actually say? And there's a number of lines of inquiry that we can take. And I think we should do all of these things, and we should make sure that our solutions are consistent with all aspects of this manuscript and all aspects of these lines of inquiry. So for instance, we can look at the physical book itself. We can look at the pages, the binding, the ink and the paint on the illustrations and see what that tells us. We can look at the script and its properties and try and locate the script and look at the circumstances of composition and things along those lines. We can look at the content of the text and the content of the illustration. So we can try and identify the plants, or we can try and figure out what type of astrological diagrams are represented. For instance, are they horoscopes? Are they other types of calendars, for example? And we can look at the language of the manuscript itself. So we can look at not just the script and the letters, but how those letters combine together and what sort of properties of the underlying linguistic system might there be to, and what does that tell us about what language the manuscript is? Can we read it? Can we make progress in decipherment in that way? Is it a cipher? Is it a language at all? And so that's where the tools of language documentation come in. So I'm going to take a brief excursion, I guess, to tell you a little bit about what I do when I'm not working on the Voynich manuscript and how these tools are relevant to medieval manuscripts like this. So my academic background, as Lauren mentioned at the start of this talk, is in language documentation and language change and things like that. So my undergraduate degree was in linguistics and classics. I did a double major at the Australian University. So I did a lot of Latin and a lot of Greek and also a lot of linguistics. And I started working with speakers of Aboriginal languages and endangered languages in Indigenous communities as part of the linguistics side of my degree. And so my main research is on how can we make records of endangered languages and work with communities to do language support and language revitalization, and what sort of information can language documents like that tell us about how languages have changed over time. And so the Voynich manuscript is not directly related to Indigenous languages of Australia or endangered languages around the world, but the sorts of tools that we use and the sorts of linguistic methods that we use are somewhat similar. So working with speakers of Indigenous languages, particularly endangered languages, we do things like we figure out the grammar of particular languages. So we figure out how languages work, how you combine words to make sentences, or how you put word pieces together. How can we write these languages, or languages that historically haven't had a writing system? And I also do a lot of work with old records of languages which are no longer spoken. And so these records are a way to, they are evidence of language, but they are not something where we can just look up the answer to how a language is described in and just kind of read it off without a lot of figuring out. So to give you an example, I'm going to use the example of Gerhard Lavers's notebooks from a language called Bardi, which is an Indigenous Australian language from Northwest Australia. So in this red circle here in the Dampier Peninsula, there are a handful of Bardi speakers now, and about 2,000 people who identify as Bardi and who know the language to some degree. And here's a photo of Gerhard Lavers in 1928. He was a student at the University of Chicago. If I remember right, we have a couple of people here from Chicago today. And so he was a graduate student of Edward Sapir at the University of Chicago. He went to Australia, Lavers went to Australia in the late 1920s, actually around the time that Sapir came to Yale. But Lavers never worked with Sapir at Yale. And he got stranded on the Sunday Island mission in Bardi country. He thought the boat was going to come back next week, but it actually didn't come back for three or 4 months. And so in that time, he wrote down a lot of Bardi stories, a lot of Bardi narratives in pages like this. And so in order to work on these materials, One thing we need to do is to be able to read the handwriting. The handwriting, trust me, does not get more legible if we make this larger. It's in some ways quite easy to read, in other ways quite difficult to read. Lavers used not only English translations of the Bardi, but he also used symbols like these ones. And so part of working with the materials that Lavers collected is figuring out these unknown symbols and what they might mean in context. And then, of course, we have everything about understanding the grammar of Bardi and how words go together. So given something that Lavers wrote down, which we could pronounce something like in our guardian a number, we have to work out that there's actually a lot of structure in this word. So part of this word, the initial ng, or the early ng, means that it's a verb in the past tense. And gardi, this bit here, means that it's gathering together. Here there's a plural ar, which means that the subject is plural, and combine that with the e, that means that it's they did something, i.e. they gathered. And then this amba is a connector which goes with the sentence before it. So this whole thing means then when they were gathering something, gathering together in the past. Okay, so part of language documentation is taking things like ingara guardian number and then figuring out what the internal structure is. So we can do similar sorts of things with the Voynich manuscript. So we can work out a lot about a language, even if we don't know what the meanings of the words are. So for instance, we can work out quite a bit about a language's sound system, even if we can't pronounce the script. We can look at whether a language has prefixes and suffixes. So we can look at the internal structure of words and figure out what is going on with the internal structure of words, even if we don't know what those words themselves actually mean. We can sometimes work out whether nouns and verbs in a sentence are using these sorts of distributional properties. And so knowing things about the structural properties of the language might help us identify the language and might help us come up with a match for the statistical profile of the language. And so this involves looking at the structure of the language separately from the meaning. In short, this is basically what linguistics is. So linguistics is the scientific study of language. It's about thinking like a linguist about language, about using the structural properties of sounds and of how words occur in context and so on, in order to shed light on the structure of the manuscript as a whole. And once we do that, once we know something about that, we can then compare to other known languages, other known manuscripts, and try and make these try and make a connection. Okay, so for the rest of this talk, for the remaining 15 or 20 minutes or so, I'm going to lead you through some examples along these lines. So my first example involves the letters of the Voynich script, the alphabet or set of Voynich characters. So this diagram here shows you a set of Voynich characters and how they go together. So these are called bigrams. It's the first character in a sequence set against the second character. And we can see that different letters in the Voynich script go together with different amounts of, with different frequencies. So for instance, if we look at this 4 here in the first character, this 4 is almost always followed by an O character. In fact, it's basically followed by nothing else, and you can see that reflected by the darker shade of the shading here. In contrast to something like O, which is followed by quite a few different types of characters, but not everything. So it's followed by R or by L. Or by the 8, which is often written as D, or by some of the gallows characters, and so on. So we can build up a profile of the letters or the characters in the script, and we can compare those profiles to other languages. And so to do that, I worked with a former student, Luke Lindemann, who was a PhD graduate from our department, on looking at the language profiles of different frequencies of characters and different scripts. So, for example, I'm just going to take this example here with English. we're studying a metric called H2, which is a type of entropy. So it's called, the technical term is second order conditional entropy. For our purposes, we can just think of it as a measure of predictability. So given one character, so given the first character in a sequence, how easy is it to predict the character that comes after it? Okay, so for some characters for English, that's pretty difficult. So if you think of all the words that start with S, for example, we have words that start with S and then A, like sat, or words that start with S and then E, like set, S and I, sit, etc., or S and H, as in sheep, and so on and so forth. So many letters can occur after the letter S, and so we don't have a high level of prediction for what's going to occur after a letter like S. On the other hand, if we think of a letter like Q, then we're not 100% certain that we know what the next letter is going to be, but it's pretty likely, if we have to guess, that if we guess a U, then it's going to be that our guess is going to be right. Right, so 99 point something % of English words that contain a Q contain a U as the next letter, with some exceptions like Iraq and Nastaliq and Qantas and so on, Qatar and so on. So so we can use these measures. We can create a general measure for a script for each of the sets of letters that follow each other in this script. How predictable are they? And we can get an average measure of this across a language. And so Luke and I did this for a bunch of different languages, from using a bunch of different scripts. We used Cyrillic, Latin scripts from a bunch of different languages, Hebrew, Greek, Syriac, etc., and compared them to Voynich. And what we find is that the Voynich samples are very different from the natural language samples that we looked at. So here's this scatter plot is all the natural languages that we looked at, and the Voynich samples are all the way down here. So I should have said that for H2, the lower the number, the more predictable the script is on the whole. So you can see that there's a range of predictability in the natural languages we looked at. They range roughly between 3 and 4, and this is true no matter how many characters are used in the writing system. So this is just the ones between about 25 and 55 or so. You can see that there's a range, but the range is not like the Voynich samples that we use. So the Voynich samples are between 2 and 2.25. Okay, so this tells us that the Voynich manuscript writing system is much more predictable than most natural languages. And so then, of course, we might want to think about why that is. It could be that the Voynich manuscript is therefore encoding gibberish, or it's a hoax. It's not natural language, and so it's not likely that so it's not surprising, therefore, that it doesn't look like natural language on statistical measures like this. On the other hand, it could be, if it's a cipher, then or some sort of encoded language, it could be that the encoding system itself does something to the H2 measure to make it look like an unnatural language sample. And Luke and I tested a bunch of different encipherment techniques. I'm happy to talk more about that in the question period, but basically there are some types of encipherment that do reduce the H2 entropy, but it's quite difficult to do that. Most of the regular methods of encipherment that would have been available to your average medievalist do not do that. Okay, so H2, or the characteristics of Voynich language at the word level are quite unlike natural language. Let's now look at another measurement, or another statistical technique, and this is looking at units above the word level. So this is looking at the relationship between words, between different words, between words to each other. Sorry, my lights have really gone out now. Let me. There we go. That's better. Now I can see, and now you can see me. Right. Yeah. So the average. So we can look at the relationship between the between words in sentences or words in spans of text. And it turns out that languages differ on this metric as well. And so to investigate this, we're going to use a measure called Movable Average Token Type Ratio, or MATTR, which is basically looking at the total number of words versus the number of unique words, or the number, or conversely, the number of different words in a stretch of text. So to illustrate that, we'll have a look at our small section here of the cat sat on the mat. This has 6 words in it, right? The cat sat on the mat, but it only has 5 different types of words. So we have the repeated, and so we have 5 different words, but 6 words in total. Okay, so the token type ratio is just the number of tokens over the number of types. So for our 6-word sample here, it would be 6/5. Okay. Languages differ on, if we take different windows of different sizes, so rather than looking at 6 words, we say look at 2,000 words or something like that. Then languages differ quite a lot, and how they differ depends a lot on their complexity in word formation. So a language like Latin has a lot of different prefixes and suffixes, and so it has a lot of word types in a stretch of text, whereas a language like English has relatively few sets of different words. So for instance, if we wanted to say something like, so consider the word, I don't know, what's a good example? Consider the word page in Latin. If we're talking about oh, look, there's a page, versus I'm reading the page, versus there's letters on the page, or write or rip out the page, and things like that. All of those examples of page would be a different word form. Okay, they would be in different cases. Whereas for English, it was all just page. We have page versus pages, and that's basically it. Whereas Latin has 12 different forms of the word for some declensions. So the movable average token type ratio for Latin versus English is going to be quite different. So we can, again, look at a large range of languages across a number of different families and compare them. And here, Voynich, the Voynich script, or the Voynich language, looks much more similar to natural languages. So in this diagram, you can see, so here's Voynich right at the end with our Voynich samples from different pages. And we have, say, the Romance language family, which includes both Latin and modern French, Italian, Neapolitan, Portuguese, Spanish, and so on. And we have Germanic languages here. And you can see that Voynich is pretty similar to both to some Romance languages and some Germanic languages, also some Iranian languages. Conversely, it's quite different to some Dravidian languages like Telugu or Malayalam, spoken in India, and Turkic languages as well. Those are languages with lots of different word types. Also Latin's up here as well, and Kartvelian, Georgian languages of the Caucasus. And so that tells us that these languages, the Voynich language, if it's a language, looks much more similar to natural languages of the Romance and Germanic family than it does to, say, Turkic languages. It also doesn't look like gibberish or like meaningless generation of text. So we might expect a very high token type ratio if the circumstances of composition for the Voynich manuscript is people just writing down whatever comes into their heads. Okay, so now we have this kind of conundrum that, on the one hand, at the letter level, Voynichese looks very non-language like, whereas at the kind of paragraph level, when it comes to word forms and so on, it looks much more like a natural language. And so let's now investigate this idea in a little bit more detail. So we can use some of these techniques to try and figure out whether the Voynich manuscript is a hoax manuscript, or whether it's some sort of cipher. One thing that we haven't really known that much about is just how easy is it to produce language like gibberish. So assuming that we are making a a hoax text or something like that, what does that look like? What sort of things do people do when they set out to create language like gibberish or some sort of non-language hoax and make it look like language? And so in the Voynich class that I've been teaching the last couple of years, we've actually done this test as part of the class. So this seminar has 20 students in it at each time. And so I now have a sample of 40 different types of pages of gibberish or non-language that we can compare the Voynich text to. And they look something like this. So we did this test in class. The students wrote for 20 minutes to half an hour or so. They were told that their aim is to produce something that looks like Voynichese, and they produced a range of different types of things. So we photocopied pages of the well, not pages of the real manuscript, but we made pages based on the illustrations that they could write on. So it looks something like this. And so you can see they were able to fill the pages with text, and they were able to then we reflected on it afterwards as part of the class. And the results were pretty interesting. So the first thing that they said was, the words usually look in some way like pronounceable words. So they looked like things that could be natural language. And in fact, they found it very difficult to create actual gibberish. So they said it was very easy to repeat too much. So they had to try and make the words different, but they found that very difficult. They found it difficult to get ideas for words that weren't very similar to words in English or words in another language that they knew. And in fact, many of the students ended up resorting to languages other than their first language as inspiration for making syllable shapes. They also found it very easy to create a certain type of syllable shape and then reuse it. So they'd have lots of words that looked a bit like hadaya or something like that. And then they'd switch and they'd have lots of words like gebuni. And a lot of students did this independently of one another. They also found it really difficult. So making this test, so they had to write 1 to 2 pages. It took them around half an hour, and they really slowed down towards the end of the writing of those pages. So I think one thing we need to take into account is that people who argue that the Voynich manuscript has gibberish vastly underestimate the amount of time and the amount of effort required to make something that looks non-language like or language like in some ways, but not in others. And so that's something I think we need to keep in mind about these hoax theories. Another thing that we can say about the manuscript is that if the manuscript was composed very locally and without large level meaning, we would not expect there to be a lot of internal structure to the manuscript. And in fact, we wouldn't, or more specifically, we wouldn't necessarily expect the topics or the illustrations to bear much relationship to the text, because if it's all non-meaning, if there's no meaning behind it, we shouldn't be able to recover meaning that's associated with illustrations. And as it happens, several different authors have been able to show that this document does have internal structure, and pages do have associations and topics, and that we can group the pages of the manuscript into themes or into subjects that seem to correspond pretty closely, although not entirely, to the illustrations. And so I'm going to show you some work that initiated as a class project from the Voynich class by Rachel Sternek, Annie Polish, and Annie Polish and some colleagues, and Rachel and Annie and I have just released this. Here we used a computational technique called TF-IDF. This is a very widely used metric in computational linguistics, and it's basically how it identifies unique words or words that are particularly important to a particular subject area. So TF-IDF stands for term frequency - inverse document frequency. And so it identifies the terms which are particularly unique or particularly common to individual texts or documents, as opposed to, and are relatively infrequent in the manuscript as a whole. So for instance, imagine I'm writing a herbal manuscript and I'm talking about sunflowers on one page. We'd have a lot of the word sunflower on that one page, but we probably wouldn't have sunflower on a lot of other pages. On the other hand, we'd have words like the and has and in and so on, roughly frequently across the whole manuscript. So those words would not be particularly important for identifying topics. This technique is used, for instance, in ranking search results or in making suggestions. So, if you go onto Amazon and click on the Curse of the Voynich Manuscript, and Amazon will suggest you, if you're interested in this, maybe you're also interested in other things, some other books, and it will give you Kennedy and Churchill and Ray Clemens' book and so on. This is done through TF-IDF. So for term frequencies that are particularly associated with topic, i.e. Voynich, and relatively rare elsewhere. So in the paper that Rachel, Annie, and I put together, we looked at TF-IDF metrics for different topics based solely on the Voynich text. So we did not give the program any information other than the text and that this chunk of text was on the same page. And we looked at how these topics from TF-IDF grouped together into different groups. And we found that there's a fair high degree of grouping with these methods, but not entirely. So for instance, the recipes section with the jars and so on is all in what we might call topic 3. But topic 3 is also associated with some of the botanical section. The botanical section is spread over 4 topics and 1 page in topic 5. But topic 5 is mostly associated with astrology. Okay, so it's not a perfect match, but we get a pretty good set of groupings together. We certainly don't get any sort of random structure. Moreover, if we compare the scribes, so remember I said earlier on that Lisa Davis's work had identified 5 different scribes associated with the writing of different parts of the manuscript. If we factor in that information, we get even more resolution. So for instance, the recipe section is the work overwhelmingly of 1 scribe. The parts of the botanical section which are associated with topic 3 are also associated with that scribe. They're the pages that were pages of the botanical section which were written by that particular scribe. And so what the TF-IDF topics seem to be picking up is some combination of scribe and topic, that scribe and illustration subject material, which is really quite interesting, and I think quite an interesting validation of this method, and a sense that, and it also gives us a clue that this is probably not gibberish, that there's not random associations of words through the manuscript, but rather there is structure there that we can identify purely on the basis of the word forms without giving any information about the illustrations or about the scribe or anything else. So at this point, I just like to round up because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So I just want to think a little bit, ruminate on why the Voynich manuscript is such a mystery. So why does it have this appeal that it does, and why is it surrounded in all of these in this mystery? And I think there are a couple of things that come into this. So one is that there's this kind of overshadowing of the fakery and the hoax. So there's the Voynich hoax itself, and now this idea of a medieval hoax. It's the uniqueness, the way that some aspects of the manuscript are utterly unknown from other manuscripts, and when they are known or similar, they still look somewhat different. It's the way that it drops in and out of history and is also associated with people that we think of as mysterious themselves. So Rudolph II and the court of Rudolph II and his camera of mysterious objects, Kircher, Roger Bacon, and so on. And there's of course the content of the manuscript itself and its associations with alchemy and poisons and things like this. And then finally, there's the kind of self-perpetuating hyperbolic claims about how this person has finally solved this hundreds-year-old mystery for 10 minutes until the debugging and the debunking comes along. So we might want to characterize this as something like the all tip and no iceberg problem of many of these solutions. There was a famous in Australia Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, who was well known for his very flamboyant language. And one time he called the leader of the opposition all tip and no iceberg. But I think it characterizes some of the issues around many Voynich solutions in the same way. So they're associated with an aha moment. So there's when people describe how they came to solve the manuscript, they were looking at it and they had I bet it's this, I bet it's Latin, or I bet it's Greek, I bet it's Estonian, I bet it's Turkish, I bet it's et cetera, Hebrew, whatever language we're picking on. I bet it's Bardi. And so then they look for all the confirming evidence that would support their opinion without looking for the negative evidence and looking at something that may associate the language with their solution with the manuscript. And because humans are very good at finding patterns, and because the manuscript is very complex, it's not that hard to find some sort of plausible, more or less plausible, at a very surfacey, like ice tipping sort of level. But then, of course, as solutions, as you dig deeper, things fall apart pretty quickly. And Nick Pelling has summarized this in, I think, pretty pithy terms, that the most difficult thing about Voynich research is developing these chains of reasoning while avoiding big mistakes. And so with that, let me just mention some prospects for future work on the manuscript. So what we've shown here, I think, is using aspects of language documentation, tools from linguistics, combined with paleography, combined with examination of the illustrations and so on. We are able to build something of a foundation for investigating the language that underlies the Voynich manuscript. We're able to rule out some theories. We're able to say it's pretty unlikely that the manuscript is a non-language hoax. We're able to, that then gives us some clues as to how to address the very non-language-like properties of the writing system and the scripts. But to do this, it requires both collaboration from a number of different areas and people with very different skills across linguistics and across the humanities, and also comparative work both within the manuscript and with other manuscripts as well. So with that, I think I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. I see there's questions in the chat and questions in the Q&A. I've left a couple of links here on the page, which give you access to the Bioneological Voynich site. Voyniches.com is a searchable site of the manuscript, as well as some of the papers that I referenced in the talk. So thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing the screen and we'll put these things in the chat, and I'm looking forward to taking questions.
Thank you, Claire. That was an incredible amount of information, and the complexity of it is pretty impressive that you managed to get that into such a short presentation. So thank you. That was wonderful. We have a lot of questions. We have about 20 questions so far. I think some of them were actually answered as you went along through the talk. So I'm going to go through the questions and pull out a few to share with you. Before I do that, I wanted to just remind anyone who hasn't posted a question, if you have one, can you please put it in the Q&A box and not in the chat. And I also want to just acknowledge a couple of people that introduced themselves earlier, and I didn't get to acknowledge them. There was Kate from Boulder, who is a friend of Lisa Davis that you referenced in your presentation, Claire. And there was Glenn, who had spoken about the Voynich manuscript at the International Crypto Conference. And I think that was Belgium, Glenn. So thank you for that. Elise in Pittsburgh, who's a language pathologist and has done some research on the manuscript. And I see you're going to step aside to get your light.
I need to fix this, but hey, yeah, all good for now.
A couple of really cool memories from the days at Yale. So Mr. Elliott, I'm sorry you didn't give your first name, but it says that he remembers Professor W.R. Bennett Jr. writing about the manuscript in his textbook. And Richard remembers Harold Bloom talking about the Voynich at one of his roundtable lunches back in the 1990s over pizza. So bringing back some good memories too. So it's really nice to just, we can't all be in the same room together, but it's nice to come together as Yaleys and share memories over such a fascinating topic. I made a joke earlier that you were sort of, Claire, like a real life Indiana Jones. And I think you proved that in your presentation. And we had Jim from Essex in Connecticut who said he's channeling his inner Indiana Jones. So I bring up the reference because one of our questions was talking about popular culture, and obviously this is so fascinating. I mean, it brings to mind as well Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code, right? And people's just intense fascination with this topic, which you touched upon. So one of the questions is just wondering if the Voynich manuscript has inspired any films or novels, or how has it impacted popular culture?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I must admit, I'm probably not the best person to talk about popular culture, but there are a couple of things. So one is Deborah Harkness's trilogy. What is it? The All Souls trilogy. What is it called? A Gathering of Witches. That features the Voynich manuscript in I think it's the second book in quite some detail. And of course, Deborah Harkness wrote the introduction to the Beinecke's edition of the Voynich manuscript. There is also another book whose name I am forgetting now, but I can look it up. And it's it was released about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's a book about a book dealer who what's his name? No, I'm blanking on that. It'll come to me. But it's another one of these mystery. It's not Dan Brown, but it's in the vein of Dan Brown, about a mysterious book that no one can read, that a corporate lawyer, no, a banker, if I remember right, goes and ends up getting entangled in this collection of books Lev Grossman is the author, but I can't remember the title of the book, but Lev Grossman should find it. That's quite a good read as well. And there's a comic strip that's if you Google Voynich comics, you'll find it. So it does make its appearance in various popular culture things. I don't know if there's an actual movie about the manuscript itself, but the Wikipedia page for the manuscript has some references as well.
Okay, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the questions was whether or not this presentation is being recorded. It is being recorded. We will make it available for anyone who couldn't stay or didn't have a chance to turn up or just wants to watch again. If you want to share it with friends and family, you're welcome to do that too. It'll be on the Yale Alumni Academy website, and we will also post some of these links that you've shared with us, Claire. So I'll go back and pull some of the names that you just gave us of books. We can put that on the page as well.
Oh, fantastic.
So a number of questions really getting into the linguistics of things. And I want to go to those in a minute, but I want to start with the idea of whether or not it's a hoax. And I think you pretty much have debunked that. But there were two sort of interesting questions that come up about the manipulation of a manuscript to make it, to make a hoax seem plausible. And one question from Robert was, what would the gain be to do something like that? Why would someone have a motivation to do something like that? And the other question was whether or not we can be certain that the entire manuscript is one language rather than two or more languages. So not quite on the hoax, but just sort of getting into the realities that we can be sure about.
Right. Yeah, no, those are both excellent questions. So let me talk a bit about the motivations for hoaxing and fakery and things like this. I looked into this at one point, and I found I think it was an FBI report that looked into the like it was a study of motivations for doing something like creating some sort of hoax. And basically, most of it was money. So that was the number one reason for committing forgery or like putting together a hoax. The second reason was fame, glory, power, that sort of thing. And there were a couple of other reasons, but pretty much all of it basically boiled down to fame or money or some combination. And so I think there's of course, a question about to what extent people in the 1400s are like people in the 20th and 21st centuries. But I tend to think that at that sort of level, people are probably pretty similar and motivated by the same sorts of things, even if fame might look different in 1400s Northern Italy versus 2021 New Haven, Connecticut. But these sorts of general motivations are likely to be pretty similar. And so in making a claim that the Voynich manuscript is a hoax, we have to think about what sort of reason would they have had? Like, can we see it tying into money or influence or something along those lines? And also, what expense might they have gone to make this manuscript? And so the only remotely plausible claim that I've seen along these lines is something like maybe it was so if it is a hoax, maybe it was some sort of introduction to a secret society, or maybe it was like a hazing ritual or something. So it was someone buying their way into a particularly exclusive club. I don't personally think that that's very likely given the magnitude of the manuscript. So why would you do a 5-part 220 something plus page manuscript when you could do the same thing with 1 or 2 leaves of parchment and still have the same sort of thing? So the amount of detail, the amount of expense gone to for this manuscript seems to be out of proportion for the gain that one might get from treating it as the entrance to a secret society or something like that. Particularly now that we know that 5 people were involved in Dr. Davis's work has identified 5 different hands involved in the manuscript. Her work is relatively recent. I think it came out in 2020, but was at a conference paper before that. So that's only known within the last couple of years. In terms of the number of languages in the manuscript, I didn't mention this. I probably should have mentioned it, but I wanted to keep things relatively short. We do have evidence for 2 languages in the manuscript. This goes back to Prescott Currier in the early mid-1970s, who identified some character associations between what he called language A and language B. And these 2 languages show up in our statistical tests. They split the scribes. So some scribes write in form A, one scribe writes in language B. Whether they are distinct languages like Latin and Greek or French and German, or whether they are different dialects, I don't know, what's a good example? American English versus Australian English, but spelt phonetically rather than with standard spelling. Or whether they are 2 different encipherment methods. So maybe it's all Latin, but one set of scribes used one means of encoding, and the other scribes used a different means. That's unknown at the moment. But yes, we do have evidence for internal structure that has a couple of different linguistic codes associated with it. In our methods, we always split them, so we don't lump the whole manuscript together. But some work in the past has either looked just at one code or has lumped them together.
Okay, and I think you've touched on this, but I found it an interesting question from Kathy, who's a clinical psychologist, and says she can't help but think of someone with a well-developed delusional system when she looks at some of the images and the writing in the manuscript. So how sure are we of five versus one who was in different moods on different days or different time periods, working in different time periods?
Right. Yeah. So that's a good point. But I think so. I think we are reasonably confident that these are different people. So the characteristics of the script are things like when one of the gallows characters is made, is it made with lifting the pen up, so making one stroke, lifting the pen up, and then making the second stroke, or is it made in a single stroke where the pen stays on the parchment the whole time? Another letter is how long is the tail of the N character. So the N looks like a V with a tail on the top. For one of the scribes, the tail goes a long way beyond the edge of the V, or the edge of the initial descender stroke. For another scribe, the tail goes it goes basically up, and then there's a very small curl. One of the scribes has basically a flat, a broad curve, whereas the other, it's the angle is much more steep. And these are very consistent within the hands, but they're quite different between the hands. And so, of course, our handwriting varies from, it varies a bit from day to day and time to time. But those sorts of characteristics are, unless we're deliberately trying to disguise our handwriting or something like that, those are quite automatic things that we don't really mostly think about.
But very definitive ways of identifying that there were multiple scribes who were distinct individuals. And with that point, talking about the hands and the hands on the parchment, someone asked a really interesting question, which is it possible to examine for traces of DNA on the manuscripts themselves?
Oh, that's the answer is yes, but after 600 years of the manuscript being handled and so on, it would be very unlikely that we could trace that the DNA of the scribe would give us that we would be able to get the DNA of one or more scribes, and we would be able to locate them. So of course we're shedding skin cells and so on all the time, and there's also we could do DNA extraction from the parchment itself to sequence the genes from the animals that the parchment came from. But I don't think I don't think the chance of getting human DNA that was not human DNA from, say, Bioneological curators or members of my class over the last year or two. I also don't know how stable DNA is outside of those environments. So, for instance, when people talk about recovering ancient DNA from samples, it might be from hair samples or things like that, and the DNA, like depending on the conditions of preservation, there might be more or less material. So unfortunately, I think that we would not be able to tell very much about the scribes from the DNA, but maybe we could tell something about the animals, assuming we had a database to compare it to.
Okay. So I want to get into some of the sort of more technical linguistics questions. There's a lot of interesting ones there. And I want to go to Patricia's question. She asks, on the character 1, character 2 tests, where Voynich seem too regular to be a natural language, could you do something to remove the gallows letters, wondering if they're abbreviations and not letters? And I want to put that together with Nancy's question, because she is writing a book about the history, development, and worldwide uses of the ampersand symbol. So talking about characters. And she's wondering if ampersands, how many ampersands appear in the manuscript, and do you know any idea what they would signify?
Right. Yeah, no, those are both great questions. Let me talk a little bit about ampersands to start with. So there's this is quite difficult to search for because the standard method of transcribing Voynich characters, I think, conflates two characters. The 8 character, which is often read as a D, and then there's a character which looks more like an ampersand. So it's 8-like, but it has a straighter middle part. So rather than looking like that, if you watch my hand, it looks more like that. So it's tilted a little on the side and so on. I don't know if this is. I don't think it's particularly associated with one scribe versus another. So I think it is a genuine difference, not a handwriting handwriting difference. This is also something that one of the Voynich fonts. There are 2 ways of writing Voynich characters. One is called V101 and the other is EVA. EVA conflates all of these into a D. I think it under-differentiates, like it overlumps characters, whereas V101 has some things which are clearly different scribal variations. So like the N that I mentioned earlier. In terms of, so ampersands are of course an abbreviation, and a number of people have talked about possible abbreviations in the manuscript. If we think about what abbreviations are linguistically, they're a way of a kind of shorthand representation of longer words while leaving out some letters, or using a letter that using a specific letter for a specific thing. So for instance, if so I'm going to type a $ in the chat, for instance. That's an abbreviation of a type, but it doesn't have a particular association with sound. So it's a different sort of abbreviation from say doctor, where we take the first and last letters of the word, or different abbreviation from prof, where we take the first 4 letters of the word, and so on. So there are many different ways of abbreviating words in scribal practice. We actually looked at this and what it might do to the H2 values, and it turns out that perhaps counterintuitively, most types of abbreviation either do nothing to the measure, or they actually make it the text less predictable rather than more predictable. So you would think that taking out letters would take out letters in a particular context, and so make that context less predictable. More predictable. But what happens is it makes it less predictable, because sometimes not all abbreviations always do the same sort of thing. What does increase the entry, or like increase the predictability of the items, is systematically conflating differences in the language system. So writing sounds, so this is where we need a difference between sounds and letters. So writing different sounds with the same letters. So for instance, writing, if we, instead of using P and B and T and D as 4 different letters, we write them all as T, for instance. That increases the predictability of items, and that reduces the H2 levels. One problem though is that you need to do that alone won't do it, because the types of abbreviation we had to do, or the types of conflation we had to do in order to make, like we did this test with Latin, in order to make the Latin look like Voynichese, was basically made the text totally unreadable. So for instance, if we replace all the consonants with, or most of the consonants with C and all of the vowels with V, then we get something that's more predictable than Voynich, because we're just getting the syllable structure. But if we do something, if we do much less than that, it's illegible, but it's it looks more like the entropy levels look more like Voynichese. So what we think is probably going on is some combination of conflation of sounds, but also possibly writing some sounds with 2 letters. And that goes back to the 4-0 thing that I mentioned before. So the 4 is very predictably followed by 0. We have a couple of other characters which are very predictably followed by something else. If those are used to write the same character, and in addition, we're also having some sort of conflation of T's and D's and things like that, then we start to get to measures that look more like, we start to reduce the gap between Voyniches and regular items.
Okay, so many questions that we didn't get to ask. Lots of guesses as to what language it might be, or whether it might be a lost language or a secret alchemy text. Lots of questions about the drawings themselves, and whether the sort of ambiguity of certain of these drawings and their failure to match anything known to us indicates that the pictures are a language in and of themselves. And I know that we're coming right up against our time, and I know you also have another presentation on Monday with the Beinecke Library. So I'm going to give you the last couple of words here, Professor Bauern, and you feel free to say anything on any of those topics, or to tell us or to tell us a bit more about what's different about Monday's presentation at the Beinecke.
Sure. Yeah. So on Monday, I'm presenting in conjunction with Dr. Lisa Fagan-Davis, whose work I mentioned on scripts and paleography. We're going to be talking about our particular work on the manuscript. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the linguistic side of things. Dr. Davis is going to talk about her work with manuscript hands, and we're joined by Ray Clemens from the Beinecke, who is the curator of the early medieval collection, so the pre-modern collection, and so is the custodian at Yale of the Voynich Manuscript. And so it's going to be an informal discussion. We both have brief presentations, and then we're going to talk more about the interdisciplinary work and our work that how each of our work informs each other's work as well. I would be happy to answer further questions about unknown languages and so on. Oh, I see there's a question in the chat about so the Beinecke event is open, and we can put the link in the chat. I'm happy to briefly provide written answers to some of the questions we didn't get to. I can maybe, Lauren, we can talk about either putting them on the YAA's website, or
yes, we can post them on the Alumni Academy website right along with this recording.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let me maybe close with just mentioning briefly about the hitherto unknown language. I think that's this is one of the things that potentially like a question that really got me involved in the manuscript, because of course, as someone who works on endangered languages, where half the world's languages are currently endangered, where we've had linguistic extinctions over the course of the last 3, 4, 5,000 years, and no doubt earlier in the past as well. There's something intriguing about a language that we have no other records about. I think it's somewhat unlikely, simply because we know a lot about the languages of Europe and the languages that have been spoken in Europe over the last 3,000 years or so. On the other hand, we do have relics of languages that survive a lot longer than we might have expected. So, for instance, Gothic, the languages of the famously of the people who sacked Rome, are still spoken there are records of Gothic in the region of Crimea in the 1750s, 1,000 years after the previous records of this language. So this sort of thing is not impossible, but I think it's pretty unlikely, unfortunately. But of course, we can. I would be very happy to be proved wrong on that. So maybe that's a good point to end on.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And for those who want to join the Monday presentation, the link is in the chat. You can also find it on the Beinecke website. They have a Mondays at the Beinecke program with speakers every Monday at 4. And so hopefully some of you all will join Professor Bauern for that. And we'll see you again, I hope soon, Professor Bauern, for another presentation at Yale Alumni Academy, and perhaps a course sometime in the future for our alumni. So
I hope so. Yes, I'd like to offer a course on endangered languages at yeah, at some point in the not too distant future.
wonderful. Thank you. All right, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Cool. Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.